Thanks for tuning in as we talk today about reporting without re-victimizing, media being a partner in prevention. My name is Allison Fay. I'm with the Jacob Wetterling Resource Center, which is a program of Zero Abuse Project. I come to this work from a variety of lenses, but probably the most important lens is the work that I do as an advocate. I learn from the families of the missing and families of the exploited of what they have experienced in working with the media, and that their lessons that they have learned in some horrible ways and in some proactive, positive ways, I pass on to future clients and to professionals so that we hopefully do a better job of advocating for families in crisis. And we know that when crisis happens, there's often a microphone thrust into the face of the person who's currently in trauma. And we want to do our best as advocates to stand up for those who are going through crisis and trauma and take some of the pressure off from them in whatever ways we can. And I did a series of interviews when I was working on projects around media and crime victims, where I talked to clients in cases that I've worked with about how the media treated them. And I'll predominantly be talking about the Hussey family later on in the PowerPoint. But Amy Sue Pagnac, who's been missing since 1989, her parents talked about just that sense of, in one case, well, this law enforcement officer didn't lie to me. I knew that he had to follow rules and procedures, but he was honest. We should understand their only hope. We have to try to work with them. When we think about the media and that same sort of piece of when someone is missing, law enforcement is also under the microscope. The family's under the microscope. The community is, and there can be a lot of miscommunications between families and law enforcement with all of those different high stakes. And so, just knowing, and as Susan said, working with one person who's honest really made a big difference. Or people realizing that. Needing to work with law enforcement. And I think we can take those same lessons when we're thinking about media and realizing that to get the word out about missing people, we do need to have media as a collaborator. To get the word out about prevention, we need to have media as a collaborator, but how we collaborate and who and where and how it all plays out is dependent on each family and on different service providers. As I said, I'll be talking later about the Hussey family because they're a family who experienced a missing child and in my opinion, had a horrible experience with the media and have a lot to teach us about just what we don't want to do again when it comes to how they were treated. And to be aware that just because something is printed on social media or in the newspapers or online doesn't mean that it's true. And I think in 2020, one of the pieces that make things difficult is just the instant need to have information out there. And good quality reporters will do their work to check with 2 or 3 sources and to have it down. And people who may, I'm not, someone who might work for themselves or not have the same sort of checks and balances may take more risks. And so being aware that different reporters do things in different ways and sort of pay attention to where you're getting news and who is doing the fact checking and are they trying to raise the awareness? Are there prevention messages? Some of those bigger pictures. And the funny story that I use when I talk about this is when I was in high school, I was in a theater company for the deaf and did a lot of sign language. And so one of the newspaper in my hometown did a feature about, I was signing for a big concert, and the headline came out, it said, Allison Fay, a deaf student at such and such high school. I am not a deaf student, I am someone who does sign language, but the reporter had done their work and had a great story and had turned it in, that the editor read the story and assumed that because I signed that I was deaf and added the headline that I was deaf. And so there were so many people who asked me if I could hear or not following that newspaper came out for real. Like they, family I had babysat for like a decade, oh, can you hear? Can you not hear? I'm confused about that. And it just amazed me as a kid, you know, as a high school student, of how many people jumped to that must be accurate because it was in the newspaper without thinking about where there may have been a mistake. And so being aware of where we get our news and the different ethical considerations amongst different agencies. And so one of the reasons that I'm very passionate about helping families navigate the media is I feel like we teach best what we most need to learn. And I do work with the media in prevention, and I feel like I'm always learning, and sometimes I'm making mistakes, and sometimes they're making mistakes. And I feel like as you walk through that path of figuring out what works best, trying to share what I continue to learn. In the introduction, I talked about the fact that I serve at the Jacob Wetterling Resource Center, and Jacob was in 6th grade when he was abducted, and Jacob and I were classmates, and so he was missing since October 22nd, and then in October 2015, there was a person of interest named in Jacob's case, and this is a picture of me on that day reading a statement for the family, and I was in shock. I was completely overwhelmed. You know, I get a call from a reporter, I get asking about this arrest, and I'm just as confused as everybody else, and trying to help shape the stories and the narrative to be one of, one where the family is treated fairly and where Jacob's legacy is treated fairly. And thankfully, we were for the most part, very well treated, but it was huge, and a huge push from a lot of different people to need information quickly, and to be one person trying to give people information in a way that was respectful. It was one of the moments in my life that I will remember all the different details of how that played out in some ways, and then in some ways there are big blurs in my memory of how that played out. So having lived in a detached way, that being under that intense scrutiny as people are trying to get information for stories and trying to outmaneuver each other, I'll be bringing up some of the lessons learned through that experience as well. So the problem is that the old formula for when it came to crime and how it was handled in the media was there'd be a criminal act, there'd be a chase, and a capture. And that was basically the old formula of, okay, this bank was robbed, they're going after this person, we found this person. And those are the 3 main stories about crime. And when we think about sexual violence and interpersonal violence, it's not usually very linear. There's a lot of loops, there's a lot of 10 steps back, 2 steps forward. People may not act when they're in trauma the way that other people expect them to act. I've had people say stuff like, oh, well, that parent of that missing child seems so stone-faced, and it's like, when you are facing the worst and scariest experience of your life, the way that our bodies and hearts respond to that, it's a huge spectrum. And then you add the scrutiny to that, it's not that traditional sense of this linear event. But media does have a relationship to crime, and if we ignore that as folks working in prevention, we lose an opportunity to help shape the access that people have to services and the access that people have in the sense of being supportive of survivors. So media does have impact on policy. If they're opening up their app every morning and looking at what the highlights are, and if it's all about crime in your area, that might change how people vote, that might change how people want funds allocated. It can inform or not inform the dialogue, in the sense of if there's a story about a faith community that's targeted by offender, depending how that story is reported, it could make people be more interested in learning how faith communities can get involved in prevention, or it can make people feel like all faith communities are places where children will be victimized, and that's not the case. So, it informs or doesn't inform the dialogue. It can aid in investigations. Interestingly enough, and probably obvious to some of you, is when we work in missing children, we want to get those faces out to as many people as quickly as possible. But when we work in sexual violence, it's a different dynamic of wanting to, often not use the last name or not use a name at all, or shield identities, things like that. And one of the things that we find is when a child has been found, they're still a public figure, and we want to go back to that shielding and go back to that protection as they're living through regaining, what the new chapter in their life might be. Changing the social norms in the culture. The more that we have information, we look at around like the Kavanaugh hearing and people being aware and having discussions about what does rape culture look like in high schools and in colleges, and what the things that people did when they were what age, when they should be held accountable for what age, and what is a social norm around all the dynamics around gender and power. And there were a lot of conversations around that particular social event that were not being had on the crime pages. They're in the opinion section, they're in other politics, and so sometimes it transcends with different people writing about cases that they have never thought about learning because they didn't, that transcendence they weren't prepared for. So it changes our culture, and it's also the public perception of, well, how often does sexual assault happen? Where does it happen? Who does it happen to? And we know, and we'll talk about this, the media as an entity isn't always an accurate reflection of what's happening when it comes to crime, because it feels comfortable having those conversations and which stories are picked because they're the anomaly versus the traditional stories. And one more thing, I apologize, I was going to say this right at the beginning. It's when I say the media, we have to be aware that that is thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of people working under different bosses with different expectations, with different types of content. And so there's not one way of doing things that this entity does. It's a lot about individuals, it's a lot about relationships, it's a lot about leadership. So when we think about any type of social knowledge, there are four main ways that people gain information about a social problem or a social, it's your own experience, the experience of significant others, the experiences of social institutions, like what you learned in school, what you learned in the government, and then lastly, the media. And so the more remote the subject, the more the public perception of it is shaped by the media. So you think about car thefts, right? If you yourself have had your car stolen, you're going to have knowledge about how that plays out with law enforcement and with, just with your insurance company, all those things. If that happened to your sibling, if you learned about, when you're getting your driver's license in a social institution, learning about how that might play out. And then media, you might also see that happen in the media as well as they report on that. But because you've had experience in your significant others and you've learned about in other places, the media isn't your go-to spot to learn about car thefts, right? And interestingly, when we talk about sexual violence, it's if you or people around you are comfortable telling you their stories, are comfortable giving you information about what may have happened to them, that may shape your version of how you look at sexual violence differently than if you don't know anyone who has experienced that, or you don't know which of the people who you know have experienced that, is more likely to be the case. Media then becomes the bigger shaper of your knowledge because you're not hearing it from other people. And so being aware, it's not a survivor's job to educate the people around them, but they're often put in that position of, does this really happen? I think back years ago, I had a reporter come in to do a story about physical abuse that happened in a home. And the reporter said, well, I drove by this home from the outside, and it doesn't look like a home where child abuse would happen inside. Like, it was in a very nice neighborhood. The lawn was manicured. Like, I drove by, and I'm like, I can't believe that happened inside. And so then having a conversation with this reporter about, well, what does a house where physical abuse happened look like? Like, we don't know. It's not what the house looks like. It's what is happening behind those closed doors. And that, if that reporter continues to move in that direction, may help other people unpack some of those biases that they may have. But if they were physically abused or had a loved one physically abused, they may have a sense of what that might be like. So just being aware, the less people know stories of people who've experienced violence or missing children or sexual violence, the more they will be shaped by assuming what's in the media is more realistic. And then we have to be aware that because, you know, what is portrayed in the media may not always be the traditional story, it's the anomaly. You know, we look at the fact with missing children, they have about 2,200 kids reported missing every day, and with about 115 of those a year being kidnappings, stereotypical non-family abductions. Those 115 are likely going to get a majority of the airtime and the interviews because those cases are so rare, and because of the public's interest in learning more about that. And then a case of a 14-year-old who's run away from home may not get the same type of attention or response because of the amount of times that happens. And so it is our belief here, every child deserves to be safe, every child deserves to have resources. And so just being aware that sometimes the story that people will think to when they think of child abuse or any of the work that you may do may be these anomaly stories that still shouldn't happen and children should still be safe, but it may not be an accurate view of what you see day in, day out. So if you work at a child advocacy center and years ago there was a horrific case of a child being killed by a parent, that might be the image that everyone thinks of in your community when they think child abuse, when you're seeing the accuracy of what the full spectrum is of different abuse cases. And so when we think about public perception, the fact that those anomalies are often highlighted, that then changes the idea of, well, who are the victims? What is the nature of the crime? You know, people thinking that intimate partner violence is very rare because it's not something people talk about very much, when actually it's far more common. But who is telling those stories? What are safe spaces for people to tell those stories? And then the emphasis of crime, believing that violence is rampant, believing you're more likely to be a victim of crime when there's an emphasis on crime in the media. Also being aware that most outlets must answer to their advertisers, and so sometimes there is pressure when a crime victim is being mistreated or being harmed with an experience in the media, knowing that there is that ability to, as an advocate, to think about what might that look like, and is that a choice that you'd want to make of having people who support your agency reach out to the sponsors and have pushback for how the crime victim is being treated. It's just thinking about that idea as we think about advocacy and how that might look in a different way. And is that something that your client wants you to do or not? And does that make sense or not? But just something to think about. And then, as I said before, who is the media? Victim families can choose who they want to talk to and who they do not, and there's power in choice. You know, a victim family might say, I don't want to work with anybody from this channel because how they have treated me, and that's their right and their choice. Or they may say, I don't ever want to work with this particular reporter again, and that is also their choice and their right. And so being aware that you, as someone who works with victims of crime, also get to make that decision. You know, there are certain reporters that I'm not able to do interviews with just because of my experience with how they treated the families that I work with, where I have zero interest and zero comfort in engaging with them again. And so knowing that that's also your choice of saying, you know, I'm more than willing to do a story about whatever it is, but I would just like to ask to know who the person is who's doing the interview and make a decision based on who that person might be. And there's power in making those choices, because as we know, those who do the advocacy work, a big part of helping folks reclaim power is giving them the ability to remake choices and make their own choices and walk through the choices. It's not being their voice for them. That makes me bristle when people are like, I am an advocate because I'm a voice for my clients. It's like they have their own voice, they have their own stories. How can we elevate their voices and their stories in a way that makes sense to them and is safe and is something that's helpful? Oh, sorry. And just the idea of often when we think about what awareness campaigns look like or doing prevention, that people don't necessarily see a problem being a problem until they've seen it in the media. And so how do we find those champions that we feel comfortable working with who also have a vested interest in getting information out in the news about what is happening in our community when it comes to all the folks and their experiences. I get frustrated for so many reasons, just about that whole idea about what does an ideal victim look like. You know, well, we want to do the story if the victim is completely blameless, and everybody has a right to be safe, and often people who are targeted for a wide variety of reasons. And so what is a legitimate victim? And so being aware that there's that danger of creating what a hierarchy of victimization looks like. We, as advocates, thinking about, okay, if this family doesn't want the media in their home because of distrust and because of just fear, what might that look like? What might be other ways of highlighting their loved one's case that doesn't put them at so much risk? You know, the one example I'll use is we had a missing young adult, and the law enforcement agency released a booking photo of her as the missing persons photo. And our advocate at the time called law enforcement and said, can you please use a different photo of her, one for her driver's license or something else, because if they see the booking photo, people may be less likely wanting to help. And the law enforcement agency hadn't even considered that dynamic. It was just the photo that they had, and oh, sure. And then they reached out to the family and they got a photo that better reflected who that person was and as an individual. And so thinking about some of those, you know, there's no such thing, well, there shouldn't be such thing as a hierarchy of victimization. If somebody wants to tell their story, if there's an opportunity for prevention, you know, we can think about ways to gain traction. And I'll go through those as we go here for folks who, for a variety of reasons, whether it's race, social class, status, trust, whether it's just how that family is treated, that gives us the opportunity to educate the media and the public about, you know, someone says, well, this child is 14 and met left with someone on the internet, and it's like, yeah, that's traditionally the age of kids who are targeted by that. So let's talk about prevention opportunities for families and parents to be aware of, and then let's also find this 14-year-old, you know, and let's not put the spotlight on what this 14-year-old did or didn't do or what app they're on or not on. Let's put the spotlight on, you know, children should not be harmed by adults. If this 14-year-old's still a kid, and it's not okay. And I have lots of thoughts about that I can't fit all on a slide. So if you ever just want to call and chat about that, feel free to do so. If you're dealing with a family who's being mistreated or is not getting any traction, I'm more than willing to help come up with ideas or to just process things that may be done that may get some additional. When Sandusky was arrested in Pennsylvania for abusing boys through the nonprofit that he founded, there was a study that was done right as all that coverage was coming out, which is very interesting to just look into if you're interested in coverage, that was commissioned by the Ms. Foundation. And they found that news coverage of child sexual abuse is infrequent, and when it does occur, it's usually tied to a moment, in the sense of, you know, this person was arrested, this person working with youth was found guilty. It's like the moment, but not necessarily let's talk about this as a whole. There's very little coverage of prevention, since most reports focus on an incident after the fact. We also found that language in news stories about child sexual abuse is vague and imprecise, making it harder for readers to see what happened. And I understand why that might be, you know, in the sense of trying not to re-victimize the kids, trying to be aware that there are people of all ages and all genders reading your newspaper or your online website or whatever it is, you know, watching your television program, and what words can you say that are safe to say when we're talking about these loaded topics while there are people of different ages running around the room, you know. So thinking about how we tell the stories, and that idea about prevention. You know, there's very little coverage of prevention because it's focused on the incident and not the moments of prevention. There's also a lot of different obstacles in getting it right, in the sense that in 2020 being first is a value, and if you're trying to be the first one to click publish, you may have a mistake in there. And so again, that depends on the boss, that depends on the pressure and the just the dynamics in the different newsrooms. The objectivity, journalists all come with their own training, experiences, and opinions. I've had journalists who were crime victim survivors who saw stories very differently because of what they had lived through. And so just being aware that our own training and our own experiences, our own opinions can shape how we handle a story, just like our own experiences shape how we engage with media of any kind. Another obstacle in getting it right is sometimes there's multiple eyes or opinions on an article, and you have to find, a way for everyone to, I think back again to that headline that was done incorrectly when I was in high school. It was not the reporter who sat down to the interview, it was an editor later on adding what they thought was a missed detail. And so sometimes those multiple eyes can get things clouded in that process. Media by nature is reactionary. This thing happens, now we're going to talk about it. And so often the who, what, where, why of talking about it is tied to that specific incident and not so much the why of big picture. I've had people ask things like, well, what should the child have done differently to not go missing in a scenario? It's like, that's not the question. The question is, what did we miss? What were opportunities for prevention that we missed before this person started harming kids? Were there things in this person's life that could have been points where we could have interceded? Let's not put it on the shoulders of kids. And then sometimes the obstacle in getting it right is just lack of training. As an advocate, if you work with missing child cases, we also have that dynamic of parallel investigations. Law enforcement is looking at the family because the percentage of when a child is abducted, missing, it's far more likely to be by someone that the child knows versus someone that the child doesn't. So they're doing these parallel investigations of who had access to the child, who was around the child. At the same time, they're also looking at, could it have been somebody else? So Barway Collins was a 10-year-old here in the metro area of Minnesota whose dad reported missing and then later found out that dad was responsible for his murder. And in that process, law enforcement was having to walk that line of parallel investigations, of letting the public know this is his face, we want to find him, while at the same time looking at people who spend a lot of time and had access to Barway, including the immediate family. And so being aware that sometimes when you're advocating for a family and they're being eliminated as suspects or being confirmed as suspects, that can be a very difficult place and a difficult dynamic as an advocate. And to continue to put the focus on the child and not the dynamics that play with those parallel investigations. Barway liked watching Barcelona, cheered for Barcelona's soccer team. Barway liked working on his family grocery list. What are things about Barway that we can make human and make out there that's true, that people can connect to as they're trying to figure out who did it and the criminal aspects of the investigation. How can we keep his face out there? How can we keep him human and have that heart connection? So thinking about suggested solutions, both for reporters and advocates, for reporters to really think, to push for solutions. Okay, I'm telling the story about campus sexual assault, so let's talk to those people on the campus doing prevention work. Let's talk to those doing the advocacy work, and let's get some ideas for them of what are solutions that you may see to help change what's happening on our campus. And so we find that when there's those opportunities to highlight the helpers and to highlight the prevention ideas, people tend to be able to digest that in a very different way because they're not stuck in this crime, this trauma happening all the time. But yes, crime happens. Yes, traumatic experience happening. And here's what I can do in my community to make an impact. Here's what I can support my community. Here are things that I can say and read and engage around to help me understand what I can do to be helpful. We always want to put survivors, the lens of how would this impact the survivor of crime. And I feel like I have been very impressed in the last few years with certain individual reporters calling and saying something like, I'm doing a story, it's about family abuse, and I want to, and some of the media outlets are running a photo of the arrest photo, but then people are going to know, because it's family abuse, who the child survivor is. How can I report this ethically? So just thinking about some of those layered questions. And then with advocates, releasing statements quickly. If there is a case that you have been working on and you believe that it's going to be going to court, there's going to be a public response when the verdict comes out, work with your team to write 5 or 6 different paragraphs of this is what we'll release if the person is found guilty, and with the sentence that we can get behind this, what we're going to release if this person is found not guilty, here's what we're going to release if, so that in that moment, whenever all the eyes are looking, they have those quotes, those moments with opportunities for prevention, and that are victim-centered by doing that prep work beforehand whenever possible. And develop relationships with media beforehand. I think back, I don't know if any of you have seen the remake of Miracle on 34th Street from my childhood, but there's a scene where the kids are going to meet with the Santa character, and the store doesn't have the toys that they're looking for, but Santa tells them exactly, the parents exactly where to get the toys for the cheapest price. And sometimes that sense of, if someone calls here and says, hey, I'm doing a story on missing Indigenous women, you know, yes, that is so important, and yes, I want to make sure that we can do whatever we can to elevate that. But let me give you the names and the numbers of the 3 agencies that are Native American led in our area doing that work, so that they also, I don't want to be the one voice on that because that's not fair and not accurate. Let me show you where you can go to get good information on that, with us also standing in solidarity there. So thinking about having data ready along with relationships of where to get it. If someone calls here and I don't have the answer, am I going to get them connected to the nonprofit service provider that does? You know, yes. And then have, whenever possible, have data ready along with prevention examples. If someone comes right and says, hey, we're doing a story on international child abduction, I'm going to print out the latest NISMART study and highlight the numbers on international family abduction before I do the interview, so that they have that if they haven't found it already on their own, but just to, whenever possible, help them make their job easier by having some data ready that also makes sure that they're not pulling things that are outdated or not accurate in the work that you're doing. And thinking about what are prevention examples in any opportunity, and making sure that we're thinking prevention. It's not what could the victim have done differently, it's what are opportunities as a community, what are opportunities as individuals that we can take on to help change, you know, what's happening. I don't think I explained that very well, but we just have to be careful that when we talk prevention, it doesn't go into victim blaming. You know, here's what this person should have done differently so that they weren't carjacked. Not that's, you know, this is this person's MO when they're doing carjacking, so be aware of this MO is a stronger prevention message than blaming the victim. Building those relationships before there's a high profile case or before there's something that's time sensitive. You know, if you live in a town I mean, our agency works nationally, so it's a little bit more challenging, but if you live in a town that has you know, if you're doing child section, if you work at a CAC, there we go, there are words. If you work at a CAC, you know, connect with their public information officer before there's ever a problem. Go out for coffee, do an introduction, have a sense of who they are, so if there is a problem, you have that relationship built and you're not trying to build a relationship and figure out where your trust is for that person in the middle of chaos. Where are your resources? Who maintains your social media? If you need to get you know, if there's a high profile case and you want to make sure that people are thinking prevention, you know, putting out a quote on your own page of someone from your agency to help direct the conversation would be very powerful. If you're in law enforcement, is there an advocacy group that you trust? Because they have a lot more freedom in their messaging when it comes to, you know, thinking about things like, well, why wasn't an Amber Alert used in this case? And can sometimes come better from an advocate explaining, here's how the Amber Alert works in our state. Here are the other resources when it doesn't quite hit that criteria, so that people are aware that this kid went missing. And yes, there was an Amber Alert because of this, but thankfully people like you on the news are still getting this kid's word out and his face out there, and please continue to do so. That can sometimes come better from an advocacy group doing that work versus law enforcement. And then whenever possible, share good news. We love sharing good news stories on social media and through our media, because people are looking for good stories. And so whenever there's a story that is good and positive, even just, you know, I was at a safety fair this summer talking about internet safety, and I had a junior high student approach me afterwards and say, I'm going to go home and help make the internet safer so that the next generation of kids doesn't have to deal with what we're dealing with. You know, and like moments like that we can put up and say, yep, we did the safety fair today, and here was what one of the kids said. And those good news moments, and that energy so that people can meet us where we're at when it comes to prevention. When it comes to high profile cases, you know, having talking points actually physically written out of these are the 4 things I want to make sure I get across, and I don't want to go off on other, you know, if they try to say something that I'm worried about, maybe a detail in the case, I will just go back to these talking points. We're really careful to not make things harder for people doing the investigative work. That's not my area, that's not what I'm good at, and I don't want to leak something that they need to build their case. So having talking points and sticking with them does build trust. Having a specific person helping the family navigate, hopefully not the investigator, so that the investigator can focus on investigating, and then there's a advocate through law enforcement or through the agency that's helping the family figure out what makes sense for them with media. Practicing interviews can be helpful if it's something that they have a lot of anxiety around. Statement versus questions. There may be a family who just does not feel comfortable sitting in front of hot lights and answering questions about why their 15-year-old is missing, and that is completely valid. But they may feel comfortable writing a statement and reading that out. That could be released on social media, that can be shared from your page so that people can have that sense of the person who's missing and what they're about, what they like to do, who they are. And so then again, we can help shape the narrative and keep the focus on the person who's missing and not all the chatter. And realizing the power of social media, especially the challenge of the comment section. One of the big rules on the internet is don't read the comments or you lose your hope for humanity. And I think one of the tricky things, one of the many tricky things is if you're the person moderating the comment section, it can get physically and emotionally exhausting. And so knowing who are your resources, who are the people on staff, who are the volunteers who may have the ability to hold the baton on that for a while. And sometimes even like if we're putting up something that we know is going to make people very emotional, we'll often do a little reminder. You know, reminder, we have kids who also follow our Facebook page, so although this arrest of this crime is going to make people very upset, and it's okay, it's fine to be upset that sexual violence happens, please use words or language that wouldn't be, that is child appropriate for the children on our, or for the teens who follow our page. I didn't say that exactly the way that we would do it, but just thinking about how we shape that trust within our own community. But being aware, comments can make us very sad, especially when we remember they're not always reflective of everybody's opinion, and we can sometimes give them far more weight than what they deserve. Online, there's the Breaking News Consumer's Handbook from On the Media, and being aware that when breaking news is happening, they have a handy printable PDF that you can tape to the wall when you have a big news event with some tips. So there's the link there. You can just Google Breaking News Handbook. And some of their tips include, like, there will be details that get wrong right in the immediate aftermath as people are racing to get things online. Big news does bring out the fakers. Pay attention to the language that the media uses. And so some of those messages can just be helpful for you as an advocate, saying, yep, in the immediate aftermath of this child being taken, there was a lot of focus was given to where mom was that night. We now know mom was here at this location that night, and that's no longer a part of what's happening, so let's go back. I should say, and I apologize for jumping too far, I'm very, very, very careful to say anything related to any open case. I usually talk broadly about, you know, if it's a missing case, saying I can answer missing people questions generally, and then the specifics about this case you would need to get from the PIO or the law enforcement or the family, just so that, especially if I haven't yet built a relationship with anybody there, that I'm not making it worse for anybody else. Being aware that most media outlets would appreciate training. You know, 85% of journalists say, yes, I would want more training staff development. So that might be, if you get frustrated with your local outlets and how things are, and you're a professional who works in this field, offering, you know, a training, offering a webinar, offering some, you know, a sit-down meeting or a chance, you know, a 10-minute meeting, 15-minute meeting in the newsroom with competitors, just talk about your concerns, may open the door for people to be more trauma informed in the work that they're doing. Because the good news is 8 in 10 people who experience training as a journalist will share that training. And so thinking about that idea of, this is specifically around Knight sponsored training as they train for digital training, but 8 of the 10 people who went to their class spread that information along. So even if you sit down with 3 or 2 or 1 reporter and you feel like, oh, this is such a small, there's that ripple effect of someone saying, hey, I'm in the newsroom, I'm writing the story, does anyone have any ideas? And the person that you met with, can raise their hand and help contribute. I think it's important that we remember the media can be a huge asset to us, especially in the missing children world, which is the world I most often am entrenched in getting the word out and getting eyes and ears looking for kids. We look at infant abductions. They studied, what are the targets, how does this work? And they were able to, in 1999, eliminate abductions from hospitals, but then they also looked at kids abducted from homes, malls, offices, things like that. Infants abducted from hospitals, almost all of them were located and safely returned, and the media is very effective in these recoveries. And so we look at the sense of, in most of these infant abduction cases, this tends to be the pattern of the person who is abducting that infant. So putting this out, this profile out, and saying, listen, we're looking for somebody who, according to a profile, but we're not confirmed, but it's likely going to be female, likely someone who lives in the same area, has been telling people that they're expecting a baby, all of a sudden have appeared with the baby without knowing that that person has been in the hospital. And sometimes just giving that information out, you get the relatives and neighbors calling in and saying, I think I know who may be involved. And so being where the media can be a huge asset to us in prevention, or in getting the word out. Then we think about what ethics, how ethics can play out in the media, and one of the challenges and one of the things that's very frustrating for advocates is it's not just a hypothetical. We're talking about real people who are deeply impacted by choices. So Grant Hussey was abducted as a high schooler. He had been abused by a neighbor who took him on a fishing trip, and when he came back, he disclosed to his parents that he had been molested by this neighbor. The neighbor was released, charged, let out on bail, and was told to stay away from Grant. And the neighbor did not stay away from Grant and picked up Grant in his car, and then sadly took Grant's life and took his own life. And when this happened, 2 of the big things that in the media that were just horrific for the family to live through, one was one of the newspapers ran a photo of the car with the bodies in it. And so you think about the parents, opening up the newspaper, or Grant's siblings, looking at resources related to their brother and seeing the actual image of the car. Was that necessary? Another newspaper ran a story about that Grant, in the time from when he was abused, the time that this neighbor was arrested, had gone to a counseling center for GLBTQ youth to get resources because they were worried that they may be gay. And we look at, so that's a lot to unpack in the sense of, I just want to make sure here. Okay, I'm gonna go backwards and forwards. Okay, so when it came to that, there are amazing agencies doing work around GLBTQ youth, and all of us should be informed and aware and integrating that work in the work that we do. The issue with this Alternatives Counseling Center was several. One was that the family didn't believe that he could have navigated from Eden Prairie to Lake Street, Minneapolis to go and seek out those services. So it didn't make a lot of sense to them that he would have done that. And then we think about, okay, if the debate now after he was missing and killed is around his sexuality and was he or was he not, what does that say to the child who hasn't disclosed about what's happening with him, with the neighbor or with someone else? We know that the person who's being harmed doesn't say anything about their sexual orientation. It's a power control, and it's the person looking for those opportunities for power and control. So then does that prevent more young men, especially from coming forward if they feel that if they do, this information will be public, especially if it's inaccurate? And then you also have the dynamics of who does it help to put that out after after him being deceased? Will that make it harder for other kids to access services? Where does his privacy start and end? And so there are all these debates, and they did run the story. And so both of those decisions were hugely harmful to the family. And so you think about the good message as we talked to the family, you know, those that there were tips that came in, they knew that Grant was missing, they had a description of the doctor in the car that he was in. The bad things were that the Alternatives Counseling Center became a big part of the story. It changed the conversation about his murder, of being looked for this kid, and it became a conversation about, well, what was his sexuality, which then again is not a part of the story and is not a part of encouraging other people to come forward, and all the things that we know about when it comes to, as I talked about before the last slide, about power and control. It later was determined that the visit to the center was made up. They were losing their funding, and they thought that if they could sort of say that he had been to their center and get some extra media attention, that people who hadn't supported them and hadn't donated in the past would do so now. And so they did have to do a full-page apology in the newspaper, explain that the visit was made up. But even then, it still had already changed the conversation. Sometimes in media ethics books, I'll read about this case, and they just bring up the question of should they have said that he went to the center or not. And it never brings up the reality of he never actually set foot in that center. And so it went from the good, the bad, to the ugly, in the sense of the newspaper printed the photo. So when we think about when we're working with the media, there can be positive things, there can be bad things, and ugly things. And so how do we help them with our tips, move them in the direction that's helpful to the family and helpful to the community, versus them going rogue or in a way that's really, really hurtful. And as Grant's dad said, you know, a lot of people, if they believe in the newspapers, is true, and a lot of it isn't accurate depending who's doing the work and how they do it. And we look at, so the Minnesota News Council was something that existed in the 1990s, and I know this is an old case, but I feel like that there's a lot of lessons in this case that are still really applicable today. The Minnesota News Council used to be a way to hold reporters accountable by the public when they did things that were harmful, and now that doesn't exist because it's kind of social media is the check back of is this helpful or not. And so Bob Jader, who serves as the family spokesperson, we sat down with Jeannie Hussey, Grant's mom, and talked about the story and their loved one who's now missing, and talked about the families are families, not just news stories, and I think that that's really important. And then Jeannie's response of, I still remember the names of the good reporters. And if you're watching this webinar because you do work in the media and you do want to increase your ability to be more sensitive and more trauma-informed work that you do, I just want to thank you for taking time out to do that today. And so the key when it comes to prevention is availability and access. How do you change out its package? You know, if you have someone who's been missing for 20 years, what does the 20-year anniversary look like in a way that gives people something to do a story on? Stick to your message, say it over and over again in different ways. If we don't provide the content, we might not like the content. They come up with on their own. We had that experience more than once with when we were trying to be very careful about what we were saying about certain cases. Because we knew that the offender was watching in prison or, you know, whatever it might be, and a reputable agency isn't doing that work, they may find someone to be that voice on the TV who doesn't have that expertise and may make things worse. And the funny story that I often tell is just years ago, I did a story on a national news segment regarding child safety. And several weeks later, they called and they said, yeah, we have your name in our whatever online system. You serve as a child safety specialist. That was my job description at the time. We're doing a story on roller coaster safety. Would you mind coming on the news tonight and doing a national story about how roller coasters have just gone too far? We had an injury of a kid on the roller coaster. We want someone to say that this roller coaster has just gone too far. My response was, I know nothing about roller coasters. I have no background in roller coasters. I work in child sexual abuse prevention, missing kids. And they're like, we will give you your talking points. We will give you what to say. We just need someone with your name, with your credibility, with your job title to talk about roller coasters. And I turn them down for reasons. But I think of people who are given that pitch, you don't have to know anything about sexual violence, but we need someone with your name and with your passion to be the person debating this topic tonight. And it may end up being way worse than what your agency or someone else may do. So if you're not in a place where you want to do that work, which is fine, know the people who are, and know the people who, know the experts in your community and know the people who you trust and who you've spent time engaging around prevention, and get them connected to folks who do speak in a way that makes sense. And then just that I mentioned that the Minnesota News Council did shut down because now it's sort of the comment sections on stories and on Twitter and on email have that other kind of recourse. So thinking about, I talked about this already, know your resources. I apologize at the same slide basically up there, but stay connected throughout the year. The National Victim Center has written guidelines on victim rights with the media. That's something that you could actually physically hand to a client to know that they have the right to refuse working with a specific importer. They have the right to ask that offensive photos be removed, and that they can make choices. They want to engage with a certain station or certain entity based on how they're treated and how they're respected. My own frustration, there was a case of a teenager who had been missing for many years, who was thankfully recovered, had gone through hell, and I can't even imagine, and I retracted his name here just because I don't want to have him feel like he's being connected with this, how this all played out. But the O'Reilly on the O'Reilly Factor basically did a interview saying that this young man, he didn't have to go to school because he was abducted, and therefore he could run around, do whatever he wanted, and you could get away if you wanted to. You read the details in this case, there's absolutely no way that this teenager could have done things to change his experience. This is just classic horrible victim blaming on a national stage. You think about, how do we change the narrative? Is it finding an expert who understands about when young people are put in situations that they have to go into fight or flight mode? Is it talking about resources, and is it of just when it comes to what is available nationally for kids who've experienced this, and what do we see nationally in patterns? Without diving in specifically to his case and make him feel even more in the public eye as he's dealing with his own healing, but to say things like other people who've been abducted have talked about how their fear of just going day to day, that forced ongoing fight or flight, what does that look like? And so thinking about even just putting up a quote on your own page, even creating a statement, even doing a video, something to help change the narrative. We all do have a voice, and often when people see things like this, they're looking for that counterbalance. The one tricky thing is that we call out the lie, it has people remembering the lie. And so sometimes we just have to walk away from things, let the story die on its own. And that's so hard for me because my natural, my own fight or flight wants to go to the, we need to tell the truth. We need to say what happened. This isn't fair to the family. And sometimes when we do that, that just makes it a bigger news story. And so deciding when we need to walk away and what that might look like, and when we do want to push back. The family can create their own narrative without interruption, thinking about doing a statement or having a written statement, and allowing third parties to paint the picture without commenting specifically on a case. Learning from the past to influence the future. There are 3 different survival guides. When your child's missing, for parents, what about me for siblings? And then there's also a survival guide that OJJDP did for kids who were abducted who came back. And each of them have a chapter of dealing with the media. So if you're a parent of a missing child, actually having a survival guide written by other parents. If you're a sibling, you're allowed to make a sign on your door of your bedroom saying, please keep out media if you want that to be your space when you're 8 years old. Thinking about just having other people who've lived that, knowing what that might look like. I'm wrapping up here with resources. So this is one. Media toolkit resources. The Minnesota Coalition Against Sexual Assault came out with a guide for journalists, which is just a great, suggestions on language, suggestions on ethics, suggestions on places to go to get more information. There's also the reporting on rape and sexual violence media toolkit from the Chicago Task Force, also very, very helpful. And being aware that people will share and read and engage more with content when it's surfaced through friends and people they know and trust. So we want to use the trust that we have with our own followers and the trust that we have with the people in our own lives, and we're really careful with that trust. If we're going to put up a story that we know is going to have a huge emotional reaction with folks, we're going to talk as a group and say, who's going to be able to navigate the comments today if we're going to put this up? How do we shape this in a way that doesn't blame the victim? We need to have those conversations, because just throwing up stories that get emotional response may increase followers as people click, but it also can decrease the ability of people to feel like they know what to do and for people to be champions of kids. And so just the basic framing a news story, what do we want? What's our message? We can keep going back to that. If someone then, well, what do you think happened? Well, we just want today people to know this child's face. They're missing. We want them to know what they look like. Please reach out. Well, what do you think happened to the kid? We just really want to make sure that people know this face. And did you know that this child loved to play this instrument, or do the, and to keep sort of reframing our message and deciding what that message might be. Websites, National Sexual Violence Centers create a packet for journalists. There's an online course that, the TAO pledge is a way for journalists to declare they're going to be transparent and accountable. And so these are some other resources. I want to thank the families who made time to talk about their experiences with me. I want to thank Teresa from Missing Children Minnesota, who shared her thoughts. I want to thank Chris Stoffer, who's the senior media consultant at Gunderson, for his expertise. And I pulled from the textbooks as noted, just for general reference, knowing about those as well, and my contact information. I wanted to do this in under an hour, and it looks like I have 20 seconds of breathing time. Normally this is a chance to engage and have some questions and do some more back and forth, but the webinar does not allow for that format. So hopefully this sort of is a first place to start with thinking about how your agency, how your colleagues can think about prevention, and maybe having some staff meetings around that as you work to build relationships with folks in your community who understand, who want to help get the word out that we can end child abuse. Thank you so much.